All right, so we've got the lumbo-pelvic-hip complex today. This is going to be the #1 place where we see most individuals deal with aches and pains at some point. While I definitely think that ankle dysfunction is the most common, we definitely know that there's the most injuries that take place in the lumbo-pelvic-hip complex, just amongst general populations. So, like if ankle sprains are the most common amongst athletes, low back pain is the most common amongst humans. So we are definitely going to see a lot of aches and pains there. We want to kind of go over that. So when we're talking about the lumbo-pelvic-hip complex, just so you guys are aware, we are talking about like where your lumbar spine meets your pelvis, which will interact with your femur. So it is a couple separate joints here that we're going to be talking about today. So your lumbar spine, right? That's all of the lumbar portion of your discs. That's your L1 through 5. Then you've got your thoracic spine, which is the 12 vertebrae in your mid back. We'll look in the cervical spine later. We have got your pelvic girdle. Your pelvic girdle is going to be the two sides of your acetabulum. Acetabulum, by the way, is a big fancy term for pelvis that nobody really ever uses unless they're talking specifically about anatomy. You're just going to say pelvis, but technically it's like you've got a left ilium and a right ilium, and those are the two sides of your pelvis, and where they come together, we call the whole thing your acetabulum. So the pelvic girdle is how both of your pelvic bones, the two sides of the acetabulum, are interacting with your sacrum and your coccyx, right? So that is your sacrum is that triangle-shaped bone that holds the two sides of your pelvis together, and then your coccyx is your actual tailbone at the very end. It's sort of what's left of our tails. And then lastly, we've got our hip joint. Your hip joint is where your femur, that bone we were talking about last time, is interacting with our pelvis. Okay, so those are sort of different structures. Really, honestly, at most of today, we're going to spend our time looking at lumbar, pelvic girdle, and hip joint. If there's dysfunction in any of those, they're going to affect the other ones. But obviously, that can also travel up to our upper back as well. Just separating out those two sections of separating out of those sections of our spine. Here you can see are the various sections. Here you can see there's your cervical spine, thoracic spine, that's your T1 through 12, lumbar spine, that's your L1 through 5. By the way, you're going to count from top to bottom. So this is L1, L2, L3, L4, and there's the L5. Generally, when people have dysfunction, it's usually L4, L5, so it's right in here. So you'll hear people talking about like herniations in their discs, and so they're talking about these little spacers in between the bones there. So herniation is very, very common. We'll be going over what that means today. And then thoracic spine, T1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way through 12. So here's your pelvic girdle, right? It's the two sides here. Now the ilium is the upper portion here. And then you got the pubis, which is down below, as well as the ischium, which is the backside of this little hook right here. So this is one half of your pelvis, and this is the other half of your pelvis. Put them together, we call that whole thing, like I said, we call it the acetabulum, right? And that's the overall structure of the hip, right? It's held together with your sacrum right here. And so it's just almost, I guess it doesn't necessarily look like a triangle when you actually look at it, but like true story, and I will probably end up doing this at some point today, but whenever you draw, the pelvic girdle, it's always, oh, can I get that upside down? Wait, I guess I can't. That's kind of funny. Oh no, it won't flip. Well, anyway, you draw it, everybody draws it like that. Whenever they're drawing like a pelvis, they always kind of draw it as a triangle. And so that's the sacrum there, right? And then the coccyx, like I said, this little tailbone at the end there. Fun fact about like the anatomy between like men and women. You can see like women would have, this is probably a male pelvis that we're seeing in the picture here. A women's pelvis would be a little bit wider, and these would be a little bit more flared. And then they would actually have kind of a flat sacrum and coccyx, whereas men's tend to sort of curl around like this. So sort of that butt tucked posture that we see that is much more common amongst males. As we're going through all of these sections here, right, we're talking about like what our hip joint is, right? When you hear me say like hip joint, what I'm actually talking about is I'm talking about where your pelvis is interacting with your femur. So that's called your acetabular femoral joint, which no one's ever going to say that because that's a mouthful. So we're going to call it your hip joint. And it's where your pelvis is interacting. It's a ball and socket joint, just like your shoulder. You know, one of the distinctions we are going to make tomorrow is when we're talking about the difference between like your shoulder girdle, which is your collarbone, scapula, interacting with one another. And then you've got your shoulder joint, which is your humerus interacting with your scapula. So your pelvic girdle is basically just what holds your arm on, right? And then your shoulder joint is where your arm is sort of interacting with everything. That's the same arrangement we see in the pelvis here, right? So like your pelvic girdle is what holds your is what allows like you to have an attachment, right? So that's going to be your pelvis attached to your sacrum. And then you've got your pelvic joint, your hip joint rather, which is the femur interacting with the pelvis, right? So that's what we're seeing there. And it's a ball and socket joint, just like in the upper body, right? By the way, I haven't spent too much time talking about it, but just a fun little fact about anatomy. If you see, it's called the one bone, two bone structure. The one bone, two bone structure is something that we see in mammals. So this is like a mammalian thing. And so we see it in us, we see it in dogs and cats and horses and whales, you know, all kinds of interesting stuff. And you can actually see it here. That's a really good example of one bone. And basically what the one bone, two bone structure is you see one bone, two bones, lots of bones, and then digits. And so what that is like you'll have an upper arm, two arms below it, a wrist, a palm / hands, right? And so I don't know what these other animals are. I imagine this is like some type of whale or a seal or something, but there it is, like one, two, lots, and then digits. These are all freaking, they're all scientific names. Give me I'm not that kind of biologist, internet. There we go. So here's so one, two, lots, and then digits, right? And there's a possum, right? One, two, and look at that, look at the freaking, you know, radius. It comes way up there. Or no, ulna, it comes way up there. Lots and then digits. I don't know what a sauropod is, but I imagine that's some type of like horse. There's an echidna, and there's like a dove, right? Oh, that's kind of interesting. A dove would be, that'd be not a mammal. But anyway, it's kind of a thing that we see in like mammals, right? We see it in our upper body, we see it in our lower body, and it's kind of this common arrangement that you'll see, which is pretty fascinating. Which is where, if you look at, which is always going to kind of surprise people. Which is where, like, you know, what's kind of funny about your dog is your dog's knee is, you know, way back here. It has its own patella and stuff, you know, but it's backwards, which is why they have to wear their sleeves that way. But it's the same arrangement. So we see that arrangement there. You know, this is where that's going to start. This is that one big bone at the very, 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 very top. And so it has to be held on by a girdle that's going to hold it. So you can see there's this girdle here, there's this girdle here, and that's your actual hip joint, right? So there is a little bit of a difference, right, between the hip girdle, which is the pelvis, and the hip joint, which is the pelvis interacting with the femur. And that distinction is going to be more important tomorrow. But I always like to bring it up now because it's interesting to see the similarities between our shoulder and our hips, right? We know that like we've got these big freaking powerful muscles that are moving these kind of tiny structures around, you know? So there's between 29 and 35 muscles, depending on who you ask. within like the lumbar spine and the pelvis. And we know that like dysfunctions in the lower body or dysfunctions in the upper body can actually lead to dysfunction. So similar to what we saw in the knee, right? We know that if there was ankle dysfunction, that can mess up our knee. If there was hip dysfunction, that can mess up our knee. It's kind of like this structure that's trapped between two sections. Well, the same thing is true here in the pelvis, right? If there's dysfunction in like the lower leg or at the ankle, it can affect the pelvis. If there's dysfunction in the upper body, that can affect the pelvis as well. You think about like being stuck at a desk all day, rounding your shoulders like this, you wouldn't think that that's going to have too much of an effect on your pelvis, but it travels down the kinetic chain, right? Like these muscles get tight, so then like all your body weight, starts collapsing forward. Let's say you're standing neutral, and so you start kind of collapsing like this. Well, then this part of your pelvis kind of kicks out in response in order to keep you balanced, right? Again, it's I always say this, but it's the Jenga stack, right? It's your body trying to like, you pull the block out from over here, so you got to put it over here in order to keep the whole thing from falling over. So upper body dysfunction can affect your lumbo-pelvic-hip complex. And that's why we need to look at that posture. And then obviously like that can also travel up as well. Unfortunately, aches and pains and posture it's always a two-way street. So low back pain. I know like this is where we're going to look at some of the epidemiology. We're going to look at some of the common injuries here. Yeah, low back pain. It's just a general ache or pain in the entire, like usually lumbar section, right? Very, very, very common injury. This will affect about 80% of people at some point in their life. I'm not saying 80% of people are walking around right now with back pain, but about 8 out of 10 people, 4 out of 5 people are going to have chronic back pain. That's back pain lasting for more than 6 weeks at some point in their life. Anybody in here ever thrown out their back? Let's see.
Probably have.
I have a herniated disc.
Simon, Joseph, anybody else? Back problems? Chronically, it's knocked you out for a little bit. It's happened to me. I've got it's actually not, ironically, it's not one of the injuries listed on our list here, but a little bit of like calcium deposits on my spine. It kind of runs on my mom's side of the family. And so like that spinal column is just a little bit more narrow than it's supposed to be. And if I ever irritate the freaking thing, it messes me up for a few days. My whole body likes to kind of spasm in response. So then I have to spend all this time like loosening up, which is a real pain. Yeah, very, very common. More than about like greater than, I think it's about 40% of all work-related injuries are usually related to like the trunk or the low back, right? And then 60% of those are just like the low back, and then the economic burden, this is going to obviously cost people not only like time and emotional stress and things like that, but it also costs a lot of money. Companies lose money when their employees can't necessarily like work properly, which is why we're seeing more and more corporate sponsorships in like gym situations. We are seeing actually a lot of gyms are allowing their employees like gym memberships and things like that. They're encouraging them. I tell you guys that I always go play like pick up frisbee a couple times a week. One of those is like my serious game on the weekends, but my Wednesday game is like a really casual game over in Burbank with a bunch of the Disney folks. And so like all these people from like ABC and Disney over in Burbank basically approached their management and was like, hey, can we have 90 minutes for lunch, which is substantial, and they were like, what do you need it for? And they were like, well, we want to do this on Wednesdays. And they were like, great. And so like they Disney like looked at that proposal and was like, yeah, sure, go for it, because they sort of see the value. They see the value in like having a healthy population of people that are more physically active. So that started on Wednesdays and has gotten more popular. And now Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, they get a 90-minute lunch. So more companies that do that, more pickup frisbee games, which is why I'm here to talk about the low back today. No, no, but we do know that like it's a huge economic burden. So this is, when I see this, I see a business opportunity for personal trainers. This is one of the reasons why like some trainers will go in and teach group exercise at certain times during the week in like an office. I've known trainers who actually like they show up like a half hour before their class will start, and then they'll clear out like a conference room and teach mobility classes or stretching or yoga or Pilates and things like that. We are starting to see more and more companies kind of realize that like healthier employees are actually way more productive, take less sick days and everything. So sacroiliac dysfunction, this is a very common one. By the way, this joint right here between your sacrum and the flares in your pelvis, that's called your sacroiliac joint, or your SI joint. That's what we're going to most often call it. But sacroiliac dysfunction will sort of manifest itself in one of two ways, or God help you, I guess it manifests itself in one way on each side. That would be very painful. But this is either too much or too little movement in the sacrum. So this is actually an example. If you look at your sacroiliac joints, your SI joint, zooming in, this is not an example of a synovial joint. Most of the joints, remember 80% of the joints in your body are synovial, and we spend most of our time talking about synovial joints, right? That are designed to have plenty of movement. This is not one of them. This is actually a cartilaginous joint. There's a little bit of cartilage between these two, which means it's very, very, very stable. The disadvantage, the advantage to a synovial joint is, lots of movement, right? Which is great. We love movement. But the advantage to a cartilaginous joint is that it's very stable. Unfortunately, with increased stability comes decreased, with increased mobility comes decreased stability. The more mobile something is, the more likely you are to dislocate it because you can move it too much, Well, this right here doesn't have a lot of movement. It's meant to be very, very, very stable. So what happens if it gets too much movement? Well, that's where you can start to run into like dysfunction. You can actually start to see one of your pelvis, one of the sides to your pelvic girdle actually elevate. You can start to see it rotate a little bit too much. It can get pulled around by the soft tissue around it, right? The muscles can actually kind of rip on those bones and move it around. That can create like low back pain and stuff. Particularly, we're going to see like pain in the lower back and pain in the groin whenever we see too much movement in the SI joint, right? But alternatively, even though we want this joint nice and stable and we don't want too much movement, too little movement is also not very good. That's where you'll usually hear people say they've got like a really stiff butt. Or they'll get like sciatica pain. We'll be talking about sciatica here in just a sec, but like sciatica. So one of the muscles we're going to see today is your piriformis muscle. Really big one to remember today, guys. But your piriformis is this little tiny glute muscle, this little tiny butt muscle back here, that runs from the side of your sacrum over to your femur. So there's that greater trochanter. Remember, we already kind of talked about that greater trochanter being a very common sort of attachment site, right? Well, this muscle runs right here. Now you can see there's all these nerves branching out from your, central system, and then they branch out to become your peripheral system. One of the biggest ones is your sciatic nerve. It's huge, right? But unfortunately, it has to run behind this muscle here and in front of this little muscle right here. And so what happens is if this muscle gets really tight, it can start pinching that nerve and it can interrupt the signals. And so you'll get people who will describe it as pain that sort of radiates down their leg. That's your classic sciatica. And it's the sciatic nerve being pinched. So that can sometimes happen with limited mobility in the pelvis. If it can't rotate like this, then the bone is like very stable. Meanwhile, this muscle's trying to contract, and it can sort of pinch that bone. So we'll often see this manifest itself in like one hip becoming higher than the other, or one hip being rotated compared with the other. So you'll sometimes see people with like lower body dysfunction where they'll have sort of a scoliosis like this. What I'm doing right here is I'm elevating my right hip. You can kind of see they're kind of offset, right, rather than saying neutral. So I can offset one side, right? My back just popped doing that. Or I can rotate. You'll sometimes see people will end up like this. So I look neutral somewhat, right? But actually, if you look at me from the side, you can kind of see I'm actually rotating forward here on my right, and I'm rotating back here on my left. So you'll see sort of a twisting action like that sometimes. This is a pretty difficult dysfunction to spot in your regular overhead squat, which is actually why we have another posture assessment, the single leg squat assessment. And what you'll see is dysfunction, not that one. There it is. You'll see dysfunction sort of look like this. You'll either see like, you'll see the knee cave in, and that's the one that we usually look for. But aside from that, just looking at the pelvis, we'll see a hip hike or a hip drop, or we'll see a torso rotation in either direction. That is showing like a really tight SI joint. So if we look at the muscle that controls, that's going to be the really big one's going to be the QL muscle and the piriformis. So we'll see that today in just a little bit. And then we're going to see hamstring strains, quad strains, groin strains. My friend Ryan pulled his hamstring this weekend at Ultimate, sure enough, very, very common injury. But just tight muscles in the area that are attached to the lumbo-pelvic-hip complex lead to some type of dysfunction elsewhere. Tight hamstrings, we know, tends to sort of posteriorly tilt the pelvis. That travels up. If we look at a posterior pelvic tilt, we know that that's the low back rounding, right? So we're seeing like somebody whose pelvis tends to like tuck under it like this. That's often very, very common in the hamstrings. And if you look, you'll notice that what that causes is sort of a gaping action in the back of the spine and a collapsing action in the front of the spine, right? You sort of have this flat spine posture. You lose that natural lumbar arch. But on the flip side, you can also end up with really tight quadriceps, which we know one of our quadriceps, that rectus femoris that we talked about on Friday, is also a hip flexor. So really tight hip flexor muscles can cause you to have an anterior pelvic tilt, which causes grinding in the back of your pelvis, the back of your spine, and gaping in the front of your spine. So again, this leads to spinal disc unalignment, which causes aches, causes pains, causes herniations, things like that. Joseph, which disc did you herniate, if you don't mind my asking?
I have the L4, L5.
L4, L5, yeah. It's always those two. Yeah, those are the two troublemakers. I mean, you think about it, it makes sense. They're at the bottom of the totem pole. Your entire disc is coming, and then there's the freaking pelvis coming up from the bottom. They're just trapped between, two very heavy structures.
Doctor said I'm sitting at a desk all day.
Yep, very common. Chances are you're probably this one, I would assume. This is the more common of the two. Usually.
I'm the one on the right, yeah.
What's that?
I'm the one on the right.
Oh, are you the one on this one here? The
yeah, kind of forward in the desk, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Yep. So that's the other way that'll happen. So we're gonna talk about it today. And then we see what was my last little one I didn't talk about? Groin strains. Yeah, groin strains are also going to be very common, causing like groin muscles. We're actually talking more about your adductors. So we see like a groin strain. Actually, this is what I thought my buddy Ryan had done this weekend was pull the muscle in his groin, but it turned out to be a hamstring muscle. But look at all these adductors. There's a ton of them, right? And so all these little like muscles in the groin here, you can definitely lose, when this becomes too stable and can't move at all, that bone resists movement, and then these muscles end up tearing. So there's the adductor magnus. That's probably the one that we're going to see most commonly, or maybe sometimes the pectineus, sometimes the gracilis. And then there are some other ones as well. But lastly, disc herniation. So what the heck is a herniated disc, right? Let's sort of get this idea. So here are all your, these are your discs here, right? These are your spinal discs, right? And so what a herniation is, just in general, by the way, do not Google herniation. You can Google like disc herniation. Don't Google her, it'll ruin your day. But a herniation in the medical, as a general medical term, is where the wall of something gets torn and something else starts leaking through. So for instance, like if you have an abdominal hernia, the wall of your abdomen, your abdominal muscles, gets torn, and some other type of tissue, oftentimes soft tissue, starts leaking through, and so it pushes from one side to the other. It's extremely painful. That's why you do not want to Google it. It's still in the body, right? The skin's still there to kind of hold it all back, but or maybe there's one layer of fascia sort of left. But in our spinal discs, what we're seeing is there is this little it's called fibrocartilage, right? And it's this lining here, sometimes called it's your annulus. And that lining is meant to keep all of this material right here, called your nuclear material or your nuclear pulposus. And that's there to hold all of that stuff. That's meant to like act as sort of a cushion between your discs, right? Because if you look at, look at all your discs, they're stacked right on top of one another, right? And so we have this like cushiony material, because it's like a slinky sometimes, like when you're stepping, your spine's compressing all day long, and like, it's bouncing around, right? Even if I just go like this, right, my discs are kind of collapsing in on one another. So we want to have this nice, soft, squishy material between all of our discs to protect it. But if you tear this wall, what will happen is that material will start leaking out. Now, if you look at all of your spinal processes, there we go. So see right here, this is your spinal column. It runs through the center here between, you've got your disc, right? And there'll all be that soft tissue on top of it normally, but this is just the bones for now, and the bones and the nerves. But that's your entire nervous system running straight through here, right? That's your central nervous system running through like this tube. You can see a better picture of it there, right? And it's bundled kind of similar to muscle fibers in ways, and these like little bundles here, right? But then what happens is they branch out, they stop, and then they branch out in between each individual spinal disc, right? And that's where it becomes these little nerves right here. That's where it becomes your peripheral nervous system, right? Because it's reaching out into the periphery, and then this would keep going to wherever it's going to go. Now, if you tear that lining and this stuff starts leaking out, right? If this nuclear material starts leaking out, it's going to pinch between the peripheral nerve here and something hard in the bone, right? So that's what we're seeing here. You can actually see, right? This is the central system, and then it branches. This is all the peripheral section here. But we tear this lining here, and now this material starts leaking out, and it's getting pinched between the bone and the soft material here, right? The nuclear pulposus, just so freaking hard to say, especially if you like if you're used to saying like pupulsa or whatever. So yeah, so that starts like leaking out, and that causes like a lot of like aches and pains. Causes numbness, irritation, stiffness, burning sensations, because basically your nervous system's like, what are we experiencing? And it's a nerve, right? It creates sensations. So yeah, that is what a herniation is going to be. In the spine, at least. Herniations elsewhere, it means something else, but that's what we're going to see there. So let's take a look at some of these bones. So like I said, we already kind of went over some of these, but if we take a look, We've got our lumbar spine. Each of our individual discs are their own little bones, but we sort of consider the sections, right? We get the lumbar section, the thoracic section. We've got both sides of our pelvis, right? That's your acetabulum when they're together, right? And then we've got our femur here interacting with our pelvis. And then we got our sacrum holding the two parts of our pelvis together. So again, we've got our hip joint. That's the femur interacting with the pelvis, right? It's a ball and socket joint, right? We call that the hip joint proper. But then we've also got our pelvic girdle here. Pelvic girdle is where the two sides of your pelvis are being held together with your sacrum. So do you remember when we were talking about the skeletal system early on, we talked about the two divisions of our skeletal system, right? So two different divisions, right? You've got the axial skeleton, which is like your skull, your vertebrae, and your rib cage, right? And then your sacrum is part of that, right? This is the axial skeleton. And then you've got your appendicular skeleton, right? That's your appendages, arms and legs. So this is where the pelvic girdle is what attaches your appendicular skeleton to your axial skeleton. Same thing is true up here, right? You got your axial, and then here's your appendicular, right? This is the shoulder girdle right here. There's our pelvic girdle. So it's your pelvis working with your sacrum, right? So that is your we call that your sacroiliac joint, or, you know, no one's going to call it that. They call it your SI joint because that's way easier to say, right? So your SI joint is sort of interacting between there. Again, we don't want them to be too mobile. And it's got a ton of ligaments, by the way. If you look at your SI joint, you can actually see there's a lot of, well, can I get a picture with all the fascia, please? There we go. Look at all this. Look at all these ligaments and fascia and everything, just like holding it all together, right? Just a ton of soft tissue. Why? Well, it's trying to create some freaking stability. You know, again, these are some huge muscles, right? And the same thing is true over here. Look, there's also like a lot of, you know, ligaments there holding our femur. Now that's obviously some large muscles as well, but it's also because like this is a very unmobile joint. So it's kind of like, you know, the way I like to picture it is if you've ever been, you know, doing arts and crafts or anything like that, you know, and you're trying to just like make sure something doesn't fall apart. What do? You glue the crap out of it, you know, like you just, or like tape. You know, I like thinking of it as like tape. If you're trying to create some stability, like I used to move furniture, and like, you know, we'd come and pack and load people. And like every now and then, like, you know, if you were doing like a kitchen, you wrap stuff in like a lot of paper and then you just tape the crap out of it, you know, because you don't want it moving around in the box. You don't want anything to break, you know, while it's moving. That's kind of what your body's doing. That's like, this is biology's tape. This is biology's glue, you know, all this like soft ligament tissue that's just there to create some stability where there might not be some, you know. So that's your SI joint. So those are all the structures. Those are all the bones. That is what we are going to talk about moving today. So I know I'm going to come back to this in just a little bit. But you know, we did talk about we go through our muscles, and then we're going to get to the joint movements in a little bit. But just to make sure you guys are clear on the joint movements, because sometimes the hip, because it flips directions, confuses people. I do want to remind you. Let me turn this off screen share here, and I'll be a little easier to see. This is going to be hip flexion, right? So right now, the angle between this bone and this bone, this is 180 degrees, right? So if I take it to 90 degrees, that means the angle went from 180 down to 90. That angle went down. Therefore, this is flexion. This is my hip. So we call it hip flexion, right? Or, you know, hip flexion if you want to do it that way. It's the same thing. I'm doing with a bent knee because it's easier. So Hip flexion, I've got hip extension, which would be going the other way, right? If I go from here down to here, that's hip extension. Or if I go from here back to here, that's hip extension, right? So I'm extending my hip if I go back, right? The glute kick back. So a squat is going to be hip extension. I've got hip abduction and I've got hip adduction, right? Abduction, my leg is being abducted away from me. Adduction, I'm adding it back to my body. And then because this is a ball and socket joint, we know that it can create all movements, right? Well, we're also going to see hip internal rotation. So this one's kind of hard to see, but see how my toes pointing forward? That's hip internal rotation, right? I rotate, I turn the femur this way. And then I've got hip external rotation, right? My pelvis is still facing this way, but now my femur is rotated away, right? So those are my transverse movements. So in the sagittal plane, we've got flexion and extension. In the frontal plane, we've got abduction and adduction. And in the transverse plane, we've got internal rotation and external rotation. Then I've got my spine. I've got spinal flexion, spinal extension, spinal rotation. And then there is one special one, we get that lateral flexion is what we call it, which is always confusing because you're like, what the heck is lateral flexion? Flexion's only supposed to be front to back. Well, lateral flexion just means that you're, changing the angle side to side. So you either have left, right lateral flexion or right, left lateral flexion because, it's in the center. The origin point's the same in both spots. So those are the movements we're going to see today, and that is why we've got a large list of muscles to get through. So we are not starting with the glutes, even though that's where you can see here we are starting at the hip stuff. But we're going to start with the adductors. We're going to start with our adduction list. So there's a big group of adductors here. We know that knees caving in is a very common problem, right? We go to NASM's, I always like to tie our kinesiology lessons into NASM's overhead table, So if I go overhead squat solutions table, we call it the solutions table because it's like, what do I do if my client's got this problem? Let's take a look, right? We see a client whose knees cave in, right? Knees move inward, knees cave in, right? What is our probable overactive muscles? What muscles are squeezing too much? Obviously, the muscles that do adduction. Their knees are adducting, right? So we see the entire adductor complex. So there's going to be a group of muscles here, and it's pretty easy to understand until you get to the adductor magnus. So the isolated function, this muscle, this adductor longus muscle is going to shorten. It's going to concentrically accelerate hip adduction. Look at my shocked face. Right, it's called the adductors, and guess what? It does adduction. Who would have thought? But it does do a couple other things as well. These muscles are also very commonly associated with hip flexion. So they are on the front, actually. If you kind of look at your adductors here, if we look at we'll use our adductor longus first here. If we take a look at that one. You can actually see it's kind of a good picture. It's almost a good picture, except that it's there we go. This is a really good picture right here because you can actually see there's your adductor longus. Actually, yeah. And then behind it, you can see that's your adductor magnus there, actually, right behind it. And that's the one that we're going to see in just a second. But it's coming to the front of the femur. So because of that, when it pulls, yeah, I mean, obviously this is at an inward angle, right? But because of that, it is also going to pull. It does a little bit of hip flexion. So sometimes, that's one thing people forget when they're instructing their clients to do an adductor stretch, is that because this muscle does a little bit of hip flexion, if we can actually draw this thigh backwards a little bit while we're stretching it, we're going to get a better stretch. So I'm going to pull this off share again here real quick. Most of your adductor muscles also do flexion. We're going to talk about the ones that don't in just a second, but most of your adductor muscles do a little bit of this as well. And again, how many people do we see with that anterior pelvic tilt? We know that we have way too much hip flexion, right? But we also see a lot of people who knees cave in, right? Because their inner thighs are contracting too much. So how do we stretch that? Obviously, the simple short answer would be, well, take your leg out, lunge away. Yeah, guess what? That's a really great adductor stretch right off the bat, right? Sure, love it, good, great, grand. Here's the thing though, right? It also does a little bit of hip flexion. So if I want to get a better stretch out of it, I need to take it back into extension. So when you guys can try this, if anybody's at home right now and you got a minute to try this stretch, take yourself here and with your feet perfectly in alignment, toes are, at the same level in the front, heels are in the same level in the back, right? They're not offset in any way. Just take a really big step out away. If you want, you can turn this foot to face this way. That takes the pressure off the knee. But what's really important is to make sure your pelvis stays pointing straight forward and your toe over here also stays pointing straight forward. This one, you can turn a little bit. That's okay. But if you do, see how my hips started facing this way? That's not great. I need to make sure my hips go back this way. So you can turn, but don't turn it to where it moves your hips, okay? And then, again, they're in the same exact inches. They're lined up side to side, right? Toes are in alignment with one another, right? So then I'm gonna lunge away. And I'm gonna feel a pretty good stretch in my adductor here, right? But again, because this muscle does some hip flexion, you know what I can do to get an even better stretch out of this? I can offset the feet slightly. So I'm gonna go back and reset my starting point. I'm gonna go here. And I'm stretching my left leg. That's this side over here, right? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna actually offset it. I'm gonna take my toe back. And now my left toe is lined up with my right heel. Okay, so I've got a slight offset posture here. Now I'm going to step away. I'm going to go back into the same starting position, but now I'm ever so slightly with this thigh in hip extension and abduction, right? So then I stretch away, and that is a much, much deeper adductor stretch in this thigh. If anybody tried that, you'll feel it right away.
I did.
It's good, right? Just that little offset. Yeah, love that. So where's my button? So that's.
I feel the calf too, the calf muscle.
Oh, you felt it in your calf?
Gastrocnemius, yeah.
Oh, that's funny. So they do kind of share some space. That's probably your Magnus fibers actually reaching around the back. You felt in the middle part of your calf, right? Like medial part of your calf, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, they got a little fascia that gets shared down here around the back. You can't see it in this picture, but that makes sense sometimes. So those are your adductor muscles, and you're going to see a lot of them, right? You're going to see it accelerates adduction, obviously, hip flexion, and it also does a little bit of hip internal rotation. That's one of the reasons why it's very important to keep your hips squared rather than letting them turn, right? Because if I go like this and I turn my foot out to make it easier on my knee, right? If I do that, now I'm in, a little bit of hip extension, right? But I'm losing that abduction because now this muscle this bone is internally rotating in response. You see that? So it's kind of hard to see, but because it internally rotates, it takes the stretch off. So what do we need? We need external rotation. Now I will say you don't want to have a ton of external rotation. That might make you come to the conclusion that's oh, well, if I want external rotation, I should turn my foot this way as I'm stretching. The problem with that is then all of a sudden it actually becomes a hamstring stretch because you're going from here, you're now going basically into just hip flexion. So we do want to make sure the toe is pointed forward, which is where, and I see bad demos of this all the time. I'd say this is one of the worst adductor stretch. If I Google this, yeah, you'll see people do this one here. I don't hate the butterfly stretch, but it's not my favorite. Standing adductor stretch. you'll see a lot of stuff where people will, they'll keep their toes perfectly straightforward. I have nothing against this. This is actually stretching the adductor effectively. I do think it puts a lot of pressure on this knee here. So that's what, actually, she's got her toe turned out ever so slightly. That's not bad, but I like a little toe turnout as long as your knee tracks over it. When you're doing this one, these are actually pretty decent. Now, one of the common ones you'll see, I just saw it and I didn't like it. Oh wait, there it goes. This guy. You'll see people do this, right? Now, what he's doing here is he's got external rotation, right, of the hip, right? So his hip is external rotation. Now that seems good because our adductor does internal rotation, right? It rotates this toe this way towards the middle. But the problem is, if you actually look at the alignment of his pelvis, right? If we were to just like swing this leg back over here, that's a hamstring stretch. He might get a little adductor action there, for sure. I'm not gonna say it's not at all, but like, I'm definitely not as big a fan of this for the adductors. Now, in general, do I like this stretch? That's called a Cossack stretch, by the way. Because it's these guys from Russia back in the day with the funny hats. They used to do that dance where they like, what is it? Do that thing, this thing. So they call that a Cossack stretch. And it's where you'll go like side to side like this. Takes a ton of hip mobility. I'm a big fan of like getting into this posture, but I do think if you're trying to do this as only an adductor stretch, you're missing out on some of that proper adductor alignment. So so those are the things that our adductor longest does. And guess what? We're really going to see some similarities here. So that's your adductor longest. The next one we've got is your adductor magnus. It does hip adduction. It's an adductor, so it's not surprising. It does hip flexion because it's tied from the hip to the front. And it also does hip internal rotation. So your adductor magnus does exactly the same thing, right? These are identical sentences, right? I like to do it. I like to take my slides and switch back and forth so you guys can see that. Unfortunately, they didn't, the pictures kind of messed it up. It didn't line up properly, but your adductor magnus does exactly the same thing with the adduction, the hip flexion, and the internal rotation. At least in your regular textbook, it does. Now, this is something that NASM has done that drives me absolutely insane. I love NASM, don't get me wrong, but I would not have done this because it leads to confusion when you get more advanced. Here's the thing about your adductor magnus. It has two sets of fibers, just like your biceps femoris did. So because this has two sets of fibers, there are anterior fibers that grab the front of the femur, and there are posterior fibers. Look at this, we're on the front of the knee here, and see there's our patella. We're on the front of the thigh here, right? And then we go to the next one, see we're on the back of the thigh. There are posterior fibers that grab the back of the thigh. Now, in terms of adduction, they both work exactly the same. They both do hip adduction, okay? Cool. Anterior fibers, posterior fibers, they both adduct, okay? It's an adductor muscle after all, right? But this is where they start to stray. The anterior fibers are just like all the other adductors. They do a little bit of hip flexion. The posterior fibers, because they're tied on the backside, they do hip extension. So if you really want to stretch your adductors, I said you want to make sure you go into extension as you go away, because that stretches the adductors a little bit more, right? By taking the thigh back. By going backwards, you get a little bit more adductor stretch, right? That is not true of the adductor magnus's posterior fibers, because extension is how you contract this muscle. So if that's the case, well, then now we need a different way. We need to drive into hip flexion in order to stretch our thigh, which is where you see more stuff like this. You see like a sumo squat, or a smooth stretch, I should say. See, now we're going into this version here. All right, that's a slightly different stretch because your adductor magnus's posterior fibers do hip extension by pulling the knee into flexion and then stretching the adductor away. You're going to get the magnus's posterior fibers there. Or you've got my favorite, which is a deep lunge stretch. Deep lunge stretch is probably my favorite adductor magnus stretch personally. It's this one right here. And then what you want to do is you want to drive your thigh away. So you want to abduct it while you are down here. And you will feel that in the back of the, you'll feel it in the hamstring a little bit, by the way, because you're going into, you're going into hip flexion, which is the opposite of what the hamstring does. So you'll feel it in the back of the thigh here, but then all of a sudden you push it towards the outside, you'll feel it get deep in the groin. So that's a really good one where you go like this, deep, deep, deep lunge. I like to take both hands just like this, and then you want to drive that knee away. You'll feel that right here on the inside portion of your thigh. Alternatively, if you have a client who can't get into that deep lunge action, what you can do is you can actually have them take one thigh, one foot up onto an elevated surface. This is probably a little high. I'd say a little bit lower. And then they're going to sort of go down like this and then just push that thigh away. And you will also feel that right here in the groin. So if you get a client with a posterior pelvic tilt, or if you get a client with knees caving in, I would say a combination of both of those adductor stretches is going to be a really good way to fix that. So those are the two sets of your adductor magnus fibers. And that posterior fiber adductor magnus, the posterior portion of it, it's the only one that does the hip extension. Oh, it also does hip internal rotation instead of, I'm sorry. It does hip external rotation instead of hip internal rotation. So that's the only part of the adductor that tends to sort of disagree with all the other ones. All the other adductors, they all do adduction, and they all agree on that. But most of them do hip flexion. Most of them do hip internal rotation. This is the only one that does hip extension and external rotation. So doesn't fully get along there. Then we get our adductor brevis. Again, just like any other adductor muscle, hip adduction, hip flexion, hip internal rotation. So same things there, right? So you've got 3 adductor muscles plus a little bit of extra to memorize on one of them, right? You get your adductor longus, your adductor brevis, and your adductor magnus. And then that magnus has anterior fibers, which is sort of a normal adductor muscle. And it's got posterior fibers that kind of work against the other adductors in some ways, right? And so half those fibers pull the thigh back instead of pulling it forward, pull it into external instead of pulling it into internal. So let's take a look one more time at why we think knees caving in right? Which, by the way, we've already seen this posture before. We saw knees cave in when we were talking about ankle dysfunction, right? Well, the ankle causes this. It's like the adductors like will help, but the adductors are not supposed to help. So then all of a sudden, again, we're just seeing more and more dysfunction there, right? They kind of work together. And so a lot of times we'll see feet turn out, knees cave in happen sort of simultaneously. But if we just see what muscles are happening here, let's take a look. This is a better picture here at what's going on here. When we see this knees caving in, right, what's happening, put this in red, that'll be easy to see, is yes, there is adduction, like straight up, right? Like for sure. There's definitely just straight up adduction. We can put that, right? We definitely know that that's happening at the hip. And we'll say that we should say hip adduction. Make this this a little smaller. Look at that, right? So we definitely see hip adduction there, right? But we are also also seeing hip internal rotation, right? There we go. Trying to get this to fit. So we see hip adduction and hip internal rotation when someone's knees are caving in. Meanwhile, again, we go back to the ankle, right? We see that this is tibial external rotation. That's going to be that biceps femoris muscle, right? And then meanwhile, we are seeing foot eversion, right? We're seeing foot flattening or foot eversion. You can call that pronation if you want to. Let's put it here. So there's all there's all the dysfunction that we're seeing, right? So, you know, most of the adductors are doing, you know, all of the adductors are doing adduction, but most of them are doing that hip internal rotation. But who knows? Maybe it could also be, you know, that adductor's posterior fibers too. So we need to do a little bit of, you know, relaxing there. Now we got two more muscles that are going to do hip stuff here. Well, if you're going to do adduction here, we've got your gracilis. Now we already saw our gracilis, so I didn't put it in the notes just directly to take up more space on your guys' note pages. It just says see knee musculature, but it is in the PowerPoint over here. So you can see the gracilis accelerates hip adduction. So it's almost like an adductor muscle. It does hip flexion. It's almost an adductor muscle. And it does internal rotation. Holy crap, that's all the same stuff we saw on all the adductors except the Magnus's posterior fibers. So what the heck? The gracilis is an adductor muscle, right? Well, yes and no. The one other thing it does, though, look at here. It ties all the way from the pelvis, but rather than grabbing onto the femur, right? Like we're all the other ones. Like look, femur, right? It's pelvis to femur, pelvis to femur, pelvis to femur, right? And one more, pelvis to femur. But this one goes pelvis to tibia. So this one runs over. That's why, again, we talked about that tibial internal rotation. This is often one of our muscles we actually want to strengthen. This is probably one of the adductor muscles that we are supposed to use that we do not use enough. This is a knee stabilizer, okay? This is supposed to maybe do some adduction when it's supposed to, but it's actually supposed to tibially internally rotate. Ideally, our gracilis would actually pull this tibia back this way, which would make the rest of the adductors work a little bit less, so the knees would continue being able to push out, right? So how do we get that knee stability? Well, lots of unstable exercises. You know, again, how do we strengthen our gracilis? Because we often need to. Stand on one leg. You know, single leg bicep curl, single leg Romanian deadlift, single leg squat, single leg this, single leg that, or, you know, get on a Bosu ball, right? Stabilize and do some awkward, you know, balancy style stuff. That's going to be a good way to kind of strengthen that gracilis. Now we're starting to get into some hip flexion stuff here. But we got one more adduction section here. By the way, if you've ever wondered why the notes go in the order they do, it's the order they're in your textbook. But this is going to be your pectineus. Okay, so your pectineus is in charge of accelerating hip adduction. It's not really an adductor muscle in the group, but it does sort of live in the same spot. You can see this little short one right here. And then it does hip flexion. It definitely does a lot of hip flexion. It works as one of those hip flexor muscles for sure, and does hip internal rotation. So all of its jobs are actually exactly the same as the adductors. However, I will say when we see this muscle fire, I don't think it does as much adduction as it does flexion. So I consider the pectineus to be more in the hip flexor group personally. But look at the sentence. It does exactly the same thing, right? Look at all these, every one of these adductor muscles concentrically accelerates hip adduction, hip flexion, and internal hip internal rotation, right? So that's what we see, right? And don't forget, guys, like your knee is not perfectly adducting. When we see knee valgus, when we see the knees cave in like this, remember the valgus is the one on the right here, right? This is knee valgus. It's not just adduction. Like, yes, some of it is adducting. It's obviously coming towards the midline, but it is also internal rotation, right? You can feel it. You can see it, right? Watch your kneecap. Stand shoulder width apart, and then just try to bring your thigh perfectly in towards the middle. You'll notice you can't. It has to rotate in, right? It has to spin. So all those adductor muscles, they're not just adducting, they're also internally rotating the femur, which obviously is screwing up the whole joint, right? Makes more sense when you see the rotation. You're like, oh God, yeah, that is gonna mess up my hips, you know? So that's the adductor group. Any questions on that, guys? Questions on the adductor so far? How are we feeling? How's everybody understanding the difference between the anterior and posterior fibers? How's that part?
Pretty good. I'm getting it over here.
What's that, Simon?
Pretty good.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I missed the second half. I was like, what? Cool. All right. Cool. Let's move into yeah, let's get into glute territory. Let's talk about some butt muscles. So so your gluteus medius. This one actually has anterior and posterior fibers as well. This is another one that kind of splits. You always got to picture like anterior, posterior fibers. It's like a muscle that's kind of splitting off, right? Like it starts here, but then it kind of splays like that and then grabs here and it grabs here, right? Kind of like that. But your gluteus medius anterior fibers are going to do hip abduction. And honestly, guys, that's what I want you to think of when you think of your gluteus medius, right? Think hip abduction. But the anterior fibers do a little bit of internal rotation, and then your posterior fibers do external rotation. So when we are talking about your gluteus medius, it's really rare that we're talking about these anterior fibers. I honestly forget about this part all the time. So if I were you, I'd forget about them. Honestly, when you think of the gluteus medius, I want you to think of these fibers right here, the posterior fibers, the big main section of the gluteus medius. And that way, this is what you can think of when you think of your gluteus medius. I want you to think of this: hip abduction, hip external rotation. Now, we just went through an entire freaking huge list of hip adductors and hip internal rotators. So the gluteus medius, particularly the posterior fibers, are the direct antagonist to that entire group. That is not a very large muscle that has to work against all of these freaking guys. That's a pretty uphill battle, you know? Which is why, again, we see a lot of dysfunction in our clients' posture, right? We see so many clients who have feet turning out, knees caving in, right? And that's the other part of it, right? When the feet turn out, it causes the knees to kind of collapse inwards, which then the glute doesn't even have any choice to be able to fire because it has to work against the ankle, which has the entire force of like the ground pushing against, is trapped, right? So your gluteus medius, I would say, and you'll see it, like if I pull up the list here, we go to our overhead squat, we go to our probable underactive muscles, we're going to see gluteus medius on the list, right? We go down here, there's your glute again. We go down here, there's your glute again. Your gluteus medius is underactive on so many freaking lists because it just has a lot of antagonists deactivating it. There's all these muscles shutting it down, right? So we definitely need to strengthen our gluteus medius. And that's why there are so many. I mean, you get on Instagram, you can't, and you're on like a fitness page, you can't go, 3 posts without seeing some glute work, which I am stoked about because we need it. You know, we need this freaking glute work. So, particularly the posterior fibers are the ones we're going to talk about, but it's in charge of hip abduction. So again, that, and it's in charge of hip external rotation. So it's going to turn the foot out this way. So when we see a client who squats like this, they're adducting and internally rotating, right? What do they need to do? They need to externally rotate and abduct, push those freaking knees out, right? And that's why ideally our squats, I actually like a little bit of a foot turnout. You know, whenever I'm barbell squatting, I should be able to squat like this with toes pointing straight forward. And that's why the overhead squat is toes forward. But on a barbell squat, I actually like a little bit of a foot turnout, right? Put that bar on my back. I like to have my feet turning slightly out because it allows me to push my knees and activate that side glute muscle. And as I squat down, right, I'm driving it out and it's tracking directly over my toes, right? That's what we want to see in an ideal squat. So if you have trouble activating your gluteus medius, you got to turn those freaking butt muscles on. And that's why we have things like clamshells. It's a really great exercise to turn on your gluteus medius, right? It looks simple, and it is. It's a simple exercise, but it's a good glute activator, right? Heels together, using the butt muscles to just drive that out, right? Or you do it with a band, right? Nothing against that. Or we do it in a side plank. That's the really hard version. Love this, right? And we just get those gluteus medius, you know, muscles turned on. NASM loves that single leg balance with reach exercise, right? By the way, not this, don't fall for that. Single leg balance with reach is reaching with your leg, not your arms, at least according to NASM. So don't, when you Google it, but you'll see, right? She's reaching. There's the sagittal, probably not going to do that one, but there we go. Boom, right? Gluteus medius, she's abducting, right? And then here's the thing that people forget when they do the single leg balance with reach. It's not just to the side and it's not just straight back. See how my toe stayed in alignment there? I just went straight back. No, it's a swing, right? I open my foot out and I externally rotate as I'm going back, right? This is supposed to be sagittal, frontal, and then transverse. If I go straight back, that's just sagittal again. And I like it because it's hip extension, but why not get hip extension and hip external rotation? Why not get the butt muscle to fire entirely? So you'll see, she does a really good demo here. Abduction, extension, and external rotation, which is all about our glute medius. So love the glute medius. This is definitely a muscle we want to strengthen. Now, occasionally we've got one freaking time where, actually, before I leave, there is one time where you will sometimes see a client with too much glute medius work, and that is in the knees cave out. You'll see the, that's not good. Really not that common, so the internet is not going to give me very many results. There we go. Sometimes you'll see this version. You'll see way too much cave out. See how his knees actually lining outside of his foot there? Ideally, this would be neutral. We align it. Remember, your kneecap should line up with your second and third toe. If it lines up with your pinky toe or even outside of your foot, that's knee varus. Not as common, but you'll see you'll see bow-legged posture. So you'll see the client who has, yeah, a lot of times people are like born with this from like, again, like rickets and things like that. But so I'm getting a lot of medical pictures here. But you'll sometimes just see it in people who like, honestly, like they ride horses, you know, they'll be on like a saddle all day. I'm just gonna pull up a drawn picture. It's a bummer, but that's your bow-legged, right? That's the knee varus instead of knee valgus, right? Whoa. Actually, this is labeled backwards. Uh-oh. I pulled up an evil picture. Don't pay attention to that picture I just pulled up a second ago. Those were labeled backwards. But there you go. There's your knee valgus. Or see, now I'm looking knee varus. So bow-legged posture. Occasionally it'll be on an overactive muscles list with your glute medius. If it is, that's where this stretch comes in really handy, where you cross one over the other and you give it a squeeze. But we really don't see that very often. Now, another glute muscle that's sometimes on the list is overactive, is your glute minimus. This does hip abduction, so it is an abductor muscle, but it does hip internal rotation. So it's very similar to your gluteus medius anterior fibers. That's why I said nobody ever talks about the gluteus medius anterior. It's because they're talking about the gluteus minimus. It's a little tiny one that lives underneath your other glute muscles. So your glutes in terms of layers, you get the minimus, then on top of that, you get the medius, and then on top of that, you've got your maximus, and that's the big one we're going to be talking about today. Probably the biggest muscle every client needs to strengthen. But that glute minimus does a little bit of that hip internal rotation. So sometimes you'll see that in clients who have that excessive internal rotation as a glute muscle that needs to be stretched. This is where, and I'm not a huge fan of it, but like a butterfly stretch, this is where this kind of comes in handy, especially the one where you lean forward like that. So there's where if I got a client with a really tight glute minimus, I'll do that one. But honestly, my favorite would be like frog pose. I think that one's going to be much more effective. So that's a good way to kind of get into that proper sort of alignment there. And again, it's just working on the right type of rotation. Now, the big muscle we want to strengthen, biggest muscle I got to talk about today, your gluteus maximus, every trainer's favorite muscle. Why? Because number one, it reduces all of the dysfunctions that we've talked about today, literally. And number two, it's the biggest muscle in your body, so working it burns the most calories. So we're kind of a big fan of this in a lot of different ways. But what does it do? It does hip extension and it does hip external rotation. So those really only the two things, right? Hip extension, you think about that, it's just driving the hip straight backwards, right? She's doing extension here on this, like, this leg's in flexion because her thigh is coming up, right? This one's extension, right? But she can just, do some donkey kicks there by kicking her thigh up towards the ceiling. That's a really good hip extension movement. You do a back extension here. That's actually also going to be hip extension. I know this exercise is called the back extension, but guess what? It's hip extension, Or you do probably the best hip extensor, or probably the best glute activator out there, the straight up floor bridge. So just simply hips down, hips up. You're literally driving it down. You're perfectly doing that extension there. Probably my favorite. Also, by the way, just kicking the leg straight back. It doesn't have to always be like a bent knee. That's also hip extension. But anytime you are squatting, right? You are doing hip extension, right? If I go from the floor, if I go from here and I'm driving up, right? I'm pushing, I am extending my hips away. So how do we strengthen our glutes? How do we know that the glute is the prime mover during a squat? It's because it's in charge of hip extension. It's the main muscle that does hip extension. So it is on our list all the time of underactive muscles, right? Gluteus maximus, right? You got a client whose knees cave in. Strengthen the gluteus maximus. Why? Hip extension isn't knees caving in. No, but hip internal rotation is. And your gluteus maximus does external rotation. So the gluteus maximus and the gluteus medius both work to externally rotate the hips. If your client's knees are caving in, that's the perfect fix. Also, we see a client with a low back arch. That's an anterior pelvic tilt. That's too much flexion. Well, we strengthen it. We go into hip extension, strengthen the gluteus maximus. It is just on our list all over the place. This is the basic list. Let me pull up the better list. Right. What about a client who is excessively leaning forward? Yeah, gluteus maximus, right? What about a client whose low back is rounding? Yeah, strengthen the gluteus maximus. What about a client who's got an asymmetric shift? That one sucks. Strengthen the gluteus maximus on one side, loosen it on the other. We'll talk more about that in capstone. Asymmetric shifts are a real pain in the butt, no pun intended. So that is those are your hip extensors, right? The list is much shorter, than our hip flexor list, and those are our abductors, which is really short compared to our adductor list. Any questions on the glutes, guys? Questions on the moneymaker?
No, thank you.
Cool. All right, let's look at the hip flexors. What about driving the thigh up towards the chest, right? So this one is going to be sort of a combo. This is your TFL / your IT band. So your IT band trainers can just not agree on this. Is it a muscle? Is it fascia? What do we call it? Well, it can contract kind of like a muscle, but it's mostly connective tissue like fascia. So is the IT band a muscle? You know what? I'm not going to try to settle that debate today. But I will say it shares an origin with your tensor fascia latae. So a lot of times we consider the TFL and the IT band to kind of be one and the same. Even though the TFL only goes from here to here and the IT band goes the entire length. So we're going to kind of put them together in your thing, in your notes here and in your book. So what does it do? Well, it's primarily a hip flexor, right? It's on the front of the pelvis. It goes to the femur, drives the femur up into hip flexion. It does a little bit of abduction. It's on the outside of the thigh there. So it's almost like, hey, that's working with my glutes to do some abduction, which I need more of, right? A little bit. But unfortunately, it runs all the way down to here. And it actually does tibial external rotation a little bit. And the TFL portion does hip internal rotation. So this contributes to the knees caving in again, right? Because it's femoral internal rotation and tibial external rotation. So the TFL right here is causing that internal and external, which is not great. Even though it's supposed to do abduction, it just doesn't do much of it. It's not very good at it, right? So our TFL is a big one. So how do we stretch? This is a very commonly overactive muscle. This is a muscle I need you guys to know how to stretch. Because look, we go back to our tight side, our overactive muscles list, right? And again, we are going to see the tensor fascia latae, the tensor fascia latae, the tensor. It's just on so many overactive lists. We need to stretch out this muscle. So how do you do that? Well, if it's in charge of hip flexion, if it does this, right, we're going to stretch it by doing the opposite. So we're going to go into hip extension. I'm going to go from the side. So I'm going to go, instead of going this way, I'm going to go this way. So I'm going to step my leg back, right? So now I've got this leg back here in the extension. I'm stretching my TFL a little bit, but it's also in charge of hip abduction. So I'm going to do a little bit of hip adduction. I'm going to bring it across in line with my feet a little bit, right? And it does hip internal rotation. So I'm going to do hip external rotation. Now you'll notice my pelvis wanted to go this way because my TFL doesn't want to stretch. So I got to make sure I line that back up. So I'm here. My foot is rotated out at sort of a 45-degree angle, and I'm in hip extension. And you'll feel that right here. You'll feel it run from here on that ASIS bone to the greater trochanter of your femur. And that's where your TFL is. So that is your tensor fascia latae. The tensor fascia latae is this section. The IT band is this section. Okay. So it's meant to be a stabilizer, But again, this is if you got a client with runner's knee or a client with runner's hip, right? They got that rubbing sensation either at the hip here or that rubbing sensation down here on the side of the knee. This is a tight muscle. So our TFL stretch, couple of them out there. One of them you'll see is this one. You can see that this one's primarily relying on the adduction and the hip extension. It's not bad. I don't hate that stretch or anything. Or you'll see freaking this one. This is an advanced stretch. I can't do this one. I'll lose my balance every time I try. But the really good one that we like, come on, internet. Well, the one NASA likes. Is this one. So hip extension, hip external rotation, and then she's going to take her arm up. That's going to get into her ab a little bit, and then she's going to lean away. So that creates the abduction part as well. So yeah, it's not bad. I actually really like some of these other ones that are out there. But that's Nassim's favorite. Another really good one, where did it go? If you can't do this one, because again, this is super advanced. I just saw somebody do it. This one. So you can see he's kind of taking his thigh across behind him while he's doing it. That's also a really good one to get in there. Or sometimes you'll even see people just do this. This is a very passive one. I'll do this sometimes with my clients, like before a session. If I'm like setting stuff up still, I'll be like, here, lay here, and I'll have them like drop one thigh down, come back, switch them to the other side. It's kind of like when you go in for physical therapy and they set you with, like if you have like a blanket, like a heated blanket, sometimes it's helpful to kind of get that to relax. But that's the TFL, okay? The tensor fascial latae. And don't call it latte. Everybody says that. Drives me crazy. Last one, well, not last one, sorry. Next one is the psoas. This is your psoas muscles. Now this is a hip flexor. It doesn't exactly look like it's attached in the hip, but it's attached to your spine here and then runs down to the femur. So that's your psoas, okay? It accelerates hip flexion and it does hip external rotation. So it actually does a little hip external rotation, which is like, no, I need some hip external rotation, but don't think you need to strengthen your psoas. We spend all day like this, sitting, right? My psoas is shortened right now, right? I'm in hip flexion. So we need more hip extension. Now, when I stand up, right, I'm gonna actually hold my ASIS here. Watch what happens, like if I just hold it in this position in relation as I come up. Look at that freaking low back arch, right? That's pushing my stomach out, right? Ideally, I should be in alignment here. That is what your psoas does. So it pulls your spine forward and arches your pelvis, right? That is why this is our, big bad hip flexor muscle here. Now it also does extension of the spine because it's pulling your spine into that extra arch, right? Now it is supposed to do a little bit of rotation as well. This side rotates you this way, this side rotates you that way, right? But yeah, this is a very, very, very tight muscle. Your psoas is really the big one. This is actually why whenever we're doing hip flexor stretches, guys, we're gonna go like this. This is a rectus femoris stretch, right? But this is why we take our arm up, because that's pulling my abdomen, right? And that's going to stretch out my psoas a little bit better. So that's a really tight hip flexor muscle. This is what we're talking about. When Nassim says, when you look in your book and you see that overhead table that's telling you how to fix things, and you see like the client with the low back arch, and it says hip flexor complex. What they mean when they say hip flexor complex is it's all the muscles that are doing hip flexion. So the TFL, the psoas, and you're gonna see I've got that rectus femoris, that should be on the list, although it'll come back in a bit. And then we got one more, the iliacus. Okay, so the iliacus, the next one we're going to see, it actually lives on the inside here. So this is what's kind of funny about this picture. A lot of times, like, you can see it here. That's your iliacus in the background in this picture, and then it's in the foreground here. Right, so it's on the ilium and then goes to the femur. So here's the thing: they both start in the same place. See how or I guess they insert in the same place. They both end in the same spot. So a lot of times people consider this to be one muscle. So you'll hear people refer to what are called the iliopsoas, and that's the psoas and the iliacus muscle. So the psoas does the hip flexion. The iliacus also does the hip flexion. So hip flexion and hip external rotation. Both of these muscles are really, 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 really tight on most people. You are flexing them when you are sitting down, and they work opposite of your gluteus maximus. So these are two of the muscles that are inhibiting your gluteus maximus. They are working against your glutes to allow you to, this is messing up our squats. The psoas are pulling on the spine, the iliacus is pulling on the femur. All of it comes together, psoas, iliacus, all of it comes together to result in an anterior pelvic tilt. That pelvic anterior rotation that we see, right? Where someone is just dropping the hips way too far forward. And you can actually see it here. So there's the iliopsoas on the front that are pulling down. And I remember the rectus femoris, that's that quadriceps muscle from Friday, it also pulls down. So both those muscles pull down the front. And then we're about to get into the low back here in just a second. That's gonna pull up in the back. So I put a little note in here. This is just to kind of help you out. But the combined efforts of the psoas and the iliacus is generally referred to as the iliopsoas. We got one more hip flexor here that's actually tied to the pelvis directly. That's your sartorius. Sartorius, that was on our list from Friday, right? And that is that knee stabilizer. It runs from the ASIS of the pelvis, comes in across the thigh and then onto the inside there. That's mostly a knee stabilizer, but it does do some hip flexion as well. So it ends up on the list. Now, that's our rotation, that's our flexion, right? We got, we've looked at flexion, we've looked at extension. Now we've looked at internal rotation. We got one more to look at for external rotation, this poor little muscle all by itself, your piriformis, right? So the piriformis accelerates hip external rotation. It does a little bit of abduction, but don't give it any credit for that. And it does a little bit of hip extension, but don't give it doesn't do those things very well. You get your glutes there for that. But this is the muscle that I was talking about earlier. If you got a problem with sciatica, that pain that shoots down the leg, right? This is that muscle that's really tight. So it does hip external rotation. So we're going to stretch it by doing hip internal rotation. It does abduction. So we're going to stretch it by doing adduction. It does extension. We're going to stretch it by doing flexion. So probably the perfect piriformis stretch is to do hip flexion, hip adduction. So we go across our body. So I need to go here. I need to go across my body like that. And it also does external rotation. So I need to do internal rotation, which you can actually see I'm kind of doing. So I would lay on my back and I would draw my knee up towards the opposite shoulder. That's going to stretch out that piriformis. If I can handle that, but I'm not getting the results I want, I can do a slightly more advanced version. I can do that pigeon pose, which I don't think you guys would be able to see if I do it. So pigeon pose. Oops, wrong window. That yoga move. But you're gonna do the one where you're laying down. Can I get a frontal picture of this, please? No, okay. So sleeping pigeon, I guess. So she's gonna take her, into flexion there, right? So how you do it in 4 steps. Oh, that works. There's a good picture. Okay, so you're gonna take your thigh. His left knee is gonna come up towards his right wrist, and then come across the body here, and then you're gonna lay down. The way I always like to tell my clients to get into this is I go, go into sort of a plank position. Left knee goes to left wrist, left heel points to right hip, and then just lay that down. And that is going to be a good piriformis stretch. For any of you guys with sciatica out there who might be, listening, it's a really good one. Good way to fix that. All right, now we're going to see some muscles from Friday that we've already talked about. Remember, your hamstrings are involved at the hip, right? So your biceps femoris, the long head does hip extension. The semimembranosus and the semitendinosus, which is the picture's missing. The medial hamstring and the lateral hamstring, both the hamstrings, they assist in hip extension, but they're often not supposed to do as much work as they do, so they often get really, really tight. So they are hip extensor muscles. They're working with your gluteus maximus. In the quadriceps, your rectus femoris is working in hip flexion. So again, this is tied at that is not a great picture of the rectus femoris. Let me pull up a better picture here. Like that better. So you can see this is coming from the pelvis all the way to the tibia, right? That is a quadricep muscle. It's a knee extensor, yes, but it is also a hip flexor. So when we say hip flexor complex, guys, and we are going to say that a lot because so many clients have that anterior lid, that low back arch, right? Or they'll often have like the excessive forward lean sometimes too. Hip flexor complex is going to be tight in both of those. That is going to be the rectus femoris, the iliopsoas, and the TFL, and maybe a little bit of those adductors, right? Remember how many of the adductors also did a little bit of hip flexion. Okay, so that is the lumbo-pelvic section. Any questions, guys? How are we feeling so far? That's a big list today.
Doing good.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm seeing thumbs up. All right, love that. Cool. All right, let's look at the abs. You're like, this is what I'm here for. Show me the six pack. All right, so when we talk about our core, we know that is not just what we're seeing in this picture here. It's not just our six pack, which by the way is an 8-pack. It's also all those stabilizer muscles, right? But so there are sort of like, we have like 3 sections of core stuff that we're talking about. I put this note in here. I don't think you're going to necessarily see this too often in this class, but looking at the parts of your core, you've got what we call the local stabilization system. That's the muscles that are inner that are stabilizing the spine. Then you get your global stabilization system. Those are all the muscles outside of it. So the local stabilization system are muscles that stabilize. That's your transverse abdominis in the front. It's your multifidus in the back. The internal obliques, those are on the sides. Pelvic floor muscle on the bottom and diaphragm on top. So it's like a box that's there to hold all your discs in place, right? So front, back, sides, bottom, and top. And so all of those are stabilizers. They're directly attached to the spine. They're not meant to move your spine around. They're there to hold your spine in place. They're about resisting unwanted movement, okay? These muscles here, this list of these 5 muscles, because you got 2 obliques, right? 6 sides, but these muscles here are oftentimes when somebody has a weak core, this is what we're talking about. These muscles are often the most underdeveloped muscles, probably in the whole body. So we definitely want to work on these. Then we got our global stabilization system. This is like the abs that everybody wants. These are the ones that you see. They're external. Yeah, they're the six-pack muscles, right? These are the ones that move your spine. So you can see it here in this one, right? This is your rectus abdominis. It is attached from your sternum and your ribs down here to your pelvis. It crunches your spine. So the local stabilization keeps your spine in alignment, which is so freaking important. Your global stabilization system moves your spine around. It twists, it extends, right? It moves stuff. And then your global movement system is like where we're attaching the spine to the pelvis. We've been talking about the global movement system with all of our glutes and adductors and things like that all day today, because that's the stuff that sort of moves your pelvis around, right? Where'd I go? So let's start. It's funny, NASM, like, again, the local stabilization system is so important. It's the innermost. If it were me, that's where I would start, but they're starting with the six-pack. So the rectus abdominis, okay? This is the 8-pack muscle on the front. It accelerates spinal flexion, right? So again, spinal flexion, crunching your spine forward, right? Flexion is the cat, and then extension is the cow, right? You know, cat, cow, right? Spinal extension, spinal flexion. Oof, not bad. Don't do that on your deadlift. I don't know why that picture's there. So the muscle that is in charge of crunching you into spinal flexion, yeah, that's your six-pack. So when you're sitting up in bed in the morning, right, you're crunching yourself forward, right? That is your rectus abdominis that does that. Does a little bit of lateral flexion as well. It kind of twists you to the side a little bit. So if you do side bends, you're kind of working it. I hate side bends. Please avoid that movement. And it does do a little bit of spinal rotation, just a little bit, because it works with your obliques. So the right side contracts to draw you to the left, right? Left side contracts to draw you to the right. Then you get your external obliques, right? Those oblique muscles on the side, right? They accelerate a little bit of spinal flexion. So they kind of work with the rectus abdominis there to kind of crunch you up. But they also do a little bit of that lateral flexion, right? Again, do not do that movement. That movement sucks. And then they do contralateral rotation. So right contracts to pull you to the left, left contracts you to pull you to the right, just like we saw with the rectus abdominis. So, you know, that's what's kind of funny about crunching. Crunches actually, or bicycle crunches, you know, they work both of that. You know, you actually can get pretty well developed obliques just by doing some sit-ups. But then we get into our stabilizers, right? Let's go a layer deeper. We go underneath the external obliques. We've got the internal obliques. These are stabilizers. These accelerate spinal flexion and things like that, like lateral flexion, ipsilateral rotation. So they do a little bit of the crunching. They do a little bit of the flexion, right? But honestly, guys, their big job is the integrated function. They stabilize the spine. They are there to hold your discs in place. So we definitely like this one. I would say you want the external obliques. Yeah, do some, you know, wood chops, right? Great. You want internal obliques, do some side planks. Get into a side plank and hold, stabilize that spine. Underneath the rectus abdominis, we go one layer deep. We've got our TVA. That's your transverse abdominis, okay? Now, you'll notice this is the only muscle, guys. It's kind of fun. Only muscle on our list in our whole kinesiology class that does not say concentrically accelerates blah, blah, blah. The transverse abdominis doesn't concentrically accelerate anything. It just increases intra-abdominal pressure and supports the abdominal complex. It is there to hold your spine in place. That's its job. Then we got our diaphragm. Diaphragm honestly isn't really a posture muscle. It pulls your diaphragm. It's this little dome-shaped muscle. It pulls downwards. So it concentrically pulls this little tendon down that opens up your thoracic cavity. It allows your lungs to expand. But the reason it's on our kinesiology, because like it's like that doesn't have to do with human movement. Not really. It has to do with breathing, you know. But the reason it's on our list is because it does also create some stability. By drawing open, it creates all this pressure, which will naturally hold your discs in place. Which is why you want to take a big deep breath in, embrace your core when you're doing a deadlift or a barbell squat. It's going to create that stability by activating your diaphragm. Moving into the low back, and I promise we've got 3 muscles left and you guys will have survived. I know it's a large list today. But looking at our low back, first one we've got is our erector spinae. Look at this muscle. It's huge, right? It runs and it's like grabbing all these individual discs here, right? And it runs down here and grabs at the pelvis. That is the erector spinae. It is exactly the opposite of your rectus abdominis. If your rectus abdominis does spinal flexion, the erector spinae does spinal extension. I'm like looking, I'm like running my shoulder. I don't do run my shoulders. Spinal flexion, spinal extension, right? So it also does like some rotational movement, right? Which is why like reverse wood choppers actually work your erector spinae really well. So this is another muscle that's very overactive with, I mentioned it earlier, the anterior pelvic tilt. So it's excessive spinal extension and excessive anterior tilting of the pelvis, right? So the erector spinae is actually often on our overactive muscles list. It's where people are sitting, you know, they got that lumbar support all day that's like pushing, and it's causing them to kind of overdevelop their low back musculature. So you'll see a little bit of tightness, oftentimes causing this tilt, right? That is a muscle that we often need to stretch. So how do we do that? Well, it does spinal extension. So what do? We do spinal flexion, right? Honestly, right here. It's a great one, you know, spinal flexion, right? It's not a lot of spinal flexion, but it's enough to definitely stretch it, right? But it also does rotation and lateral flexion. So that's often where you'll see a child's pose and you walk your hands to one side. So a little rotate there, go back, a little rotate on the other side. That's another really good one. And that can kind of work on loosening up, you know, that erector spinae if you've got that anterior pelvic tilt. Alternatively, you can also do this one right here. This is the one we mentioned in class the other day. That spinal twist, right? That's another really good way to stretch your erector spinae on that one. If you can get the leg twist under that, it's always a good one too. Or if you need a more basic one, this version here where you go off to the side. You need even more basic than that, stack the thighs. Okay, so a lot of different ways to stretch out the erector spinae there. Now, same arrangement here, right? The erector spinae is the outer group that moves the spine. What about creating stability and holding the spine in place? That's the inner layer. That is, whoop, my PowerPoint and my notes are out of order. That's your that's your multifidus. Okay, so your multifidus is the innermost layer that creates stability in the spine. You'll sometimes hear this referred to as your your multifidi, because each of these is an individual separate muscle. That's also sometimes called your transversospinalis muscle, but it's way harder to say. So these little individual itty bitty muscles that are there to stabilize each of your individual spinal discs, right? So they do a little bit of extension, they do a little bit of rotation, but it's not their job. Their job is to, again, just like the transverse abdominis, create spinal stability, isometrically stabilize your spine. That's the real big one that we see there. And we got the QL. This is that muscle. Remember earlier I talked about, like, you know, too much of this pulling the pelvis up on either side. That's the quadratus lumborum. So it's from your bottom rib to the top of your pelvis. And so it does lateral spinal flexion. It's in charge of a little bit of this and a little bit of this. Okay, too much strength in that on one side, right? Remember, that's like causing tightness, and it increases mobility. That causes groin and hip pain. And then lack of movement in the QL causes like gluteus maximus. So if your QL and your piriformis are really tight, you'll have no movement in your sacrum at all. And that causes that like stiffness, pain in your butt. So we want to stretch our QL and want to strengthen our piriformis. Best way to do that, your figure 4 stretch. You get a client with not enough like movement in their pelvis. This is one of the best ones. This is probably one of our best stretches the whole day, actually. Love this one. If you have a client with QL pain, at least. And that's a very similar to like pigeon. If they can't do that, they can start with this version here. They start on a chair. That's a much gentler way to sort of work up to that. Phew. Oh, one more muscle that will show up more tomorrow, your latissimus dorsi. Your lats do a little bit of spinal extension. They do just a little bit. They kind of work with your multifidus. They kind of work with your erector spinae. They do just a little bit of that arching right down here at the back. But yeah, a lot of muscles today, guys. I know that list got really, really large, but hopefully you got to see sort of how that all works. Again, do you need to like memorize this in isolation? Not really, right? Go back to your overhead table. Notice how you're going to see a lot of agonist-antagonist relationships here. You've got a list of probable overactive muscles that we're going to stretch. And you got a list of probable underactive muscles that we are going to strengthen. And your list is shorter. It looks like this. It's just this list. These are all the muscles that are important to us. Okay. So let's look at our movements. We got hip flexion, driving the knee up. We got a hip extension, driving the knee away. We got hip abduction, taking the thigh away. We got hip adduction, bringing it back to the mid. We got hip external rotation, swinging externally. We got hip internal rotation, swinging internally. Now we've also got an anterior pelvic tilt, which is all of that stuff dragging our pelvis down. It's being dragged down in the front and dragged up in the back, right? And then we got a posterior pelvic tilt being dragged up in the front and down in the back, right? The flat back posture. Those are our rotational movements. Then we've got the right-left lateral rotation, right? Coming up this way, or right or left-right. And then we've got a little bit of the transverse rotation there as well, right? So sometimes this one's always hard to show, but you can see like that one or that one, right? Where like one side's coming forward, the other one goes back. Spinal flexion and spinal extension. So flexion, extension, rotation. So what is in charge of hip flexion? It's the rectus femoris, that big one that runs all the way from here down to our knee, right? It's the iliopsoas, that's your iliacus, which is on this inside ridge here that runs and then through this little hole and then comes right to here. And then the psoas, right? And through. So that's the psoas and iliacus, that's iliopsoas. The TFL, right here off to the side, that's your tensor fascia latae. And lastly, the sartorius, which starts here all the way across into the knee. Those are all the hip flexors. So stretch them by doing hip extension. Simple as that. Hip extension, now we need to strengthen those muscles to draw us back, right? Gluteus maximus is the big one, right? And then there are some hamstring muscles here, right? Your biceps femoris long head on the lateral hamstring. and the semimembranosus and semitendinosus on the medial hamstring. All three of those are hip extensors, the main one being the gluteus maximus. What about hip abduction? That's the gluteus medius, right? Gonna live right here. A little bit of the gluteus minimus as well, gets a little bit of credit. TFL, a little bit of credit. Sartorius and piriformis. But really, guys, honestly, gluteus medius. That's the only one I want you to really think of when I think of abduction. Hip adduction, that's going to be your adductor complex, which is the adductor magnus's anterior and posterior fibers. Both of those fibers do adduction, longus and brevis. So just adductors. The gracilis, just that big long one that runs the whole length, and the pectineus there, which runs the whole length as well. Oh, I'm sorry, not that. No, runs a little short one. Sorry, pectineus is very short. Hip internal rotation. Look at this long freaking list. Adductor longus, magnus, and brevis, gracilis, pectineus, gluteus medius's anterior fibers, gluteus minimus, and then the big one, TFL. That is a long list. No wonder our knees cave in, right? A lot of muscles that internally rotate us. External rotation, look at this little short list. So gluteus medius, so gluteus maximus, and then like these muscles here that are all really tight during hip flexion. So like, even if we want to strengthen these, it's like, we don't want to strengthen these, you know? The adductor magnus, that's one that we don't want to strengthen, right? It's often too tight. The iliopsoas, that's often causing an anterior pelvic tilt. Sartorius and piriformis, right? Often causing, you know, knee problems and sciatica problems. So really, we're just looking for gluteus maximus and medius. Those are the muscles we want to strengthen. Now, in terms of anterior pelvic tilting, like I said, there's sort of a combo here, right? It's the iliopsoas, it's the psoas and the iliacus, the rectus femoris. You're not seeing the TFL on here, but the TFL is definitely one of these. It's on the list, but it's not in the picture. And then the erector spinae. All of that, you know, you're pulling up in the back and pulling down in the front. It causes rotation, right? Posterior pelvic tilt, same thing. You're grabbing up in the front and down in the back. That's rectus abdominis. The abdominal muscles are too tight. And then the gluteus maximus and hamstring muscles are too tight. Meanwhile, the muscles that should be doing the spinal extension, the erector spinae, is actually weak. And muscles that should be pulling down the front, your hip flexors, are also weak. Lumbar flexion. So we're talking about like crunching your spine. Yeah, it's your abs. Rectus abdominis and both of your obliques. Pulling into a back extension, that's the erector spinae. The lateral stuff, that's the obliques. Rectus abdominis a little bit. And the QL is the big one, right? QL does that lateral side-to-side movement. And then rotation, we got a little bit of the abdominals, a little bit of the obliques, kind of everything, honestly. It depends on like which rotation you're going in, right? The abdominals do contralateral rotation and the low back muscles do ipsilateral rotation. So like this pulls me, you know, like when I contract this, it pulls me across, right? Whereas these low back muscles, you know, they pull me the same side. So this is opposite side, this is same side. And that's what we see in the, man, that one's like very confusing. Guys, that's it. I appreciate you guys staying with me. I know we normally kind of wrap up in you know, about 2 hours. I know it was a little longer. But I appreciate your patience. How's everybody feeling?
Confused.
It's a large list. It's a large list. Don't, you know, don't just give in to feeling overwhelmed and confused though, right? Pay attention to that overhead squat solutions table. It has like all the relationships there, right? Agonist, antagonist, right?
Yeah.
That's the whole reason we're even studying this. I don't need you to memorize a bunch of muscles just to memorize a bunch of muscles. We care about it because of what it means in the squat, right? And the squat just means posture.
Mhm.
So, but it is a lot. So if my recommendation to you guys, take a couple hours to let the brain cool down. Don't immediately, just like when this call is wrapped up, don't just start studying right now. But take a little while and then revisit this stuff in a little while later today. Video is going to be up later today. You guys can watch that. By the way, if you ever want to just hear me say different stuff, you can always go into the YouTube channel and just go back and find the same name of the same lesson when it happened 6 months ago. Watch that video, you know. You guys are always welcome to do that. And then, yeah, start working your way through those, through those lists, and take a look at the overhead squat at some point today, and be like, oh, the erector spinae is overactive, which means if I jump to the other side it's like the abdominals are underactive, right? It's a push and a pull. But for now, let it relax. We're going to keep tying this together. We are meeting up this week. Let's see. Today is
Monday.
complex. Tomorrow we've got the shoulder. Then we got the cervical spine. Yeah. So we're meeting up on Thursday. Yeah. Other than that, let's go ahead and kill the recording.